The shovel bit into the dark, hungry earth. It was a sound Hannah Blackwood knew all too well, the wet, hollow thud of dirt giving way. She'd heard it 5 times before. 5 times she'd dug into the same unforgiving Montana soil. 5 times she'd buried a piece of her own soul. But this time was different. Rain hammered down, turning the hillside into a river of mud. It plastered her hair to her face and soaked through the thin shawl on her shoulders. Her hands, once skilled with a needle, were now raw, blistered things gripping the shovel handle like it was the only solid thing left in a world that had dissolved into chaos. Lightning ripped across the sky, and in that flash, you could see it all. The exhaustion, the grief. But underneath it, something else, something hard and unbreakable. Determination. The hole grew deeper. With every thrust, she whispered the same words into the storm. A promise. A prayer. They can take everything, she rasped, her voice swallowed by the thunder. But they will not take this. In her arms, wrapped in a faded blue cloth, was not a body. It was something far more precious. Something she had to hide. Something she had to protect, even if it cost her everything. She knelt, cradling the bundle one last time, a tear mixing with the rain on her cheek. Then she gently lowered it into the earth. She filled the hole with her bare hands, the mud cold and gritty. Each handful was a vow. When she was finished, she didn't move. She just knelt there in the mud and the rain, a lone figure on a dark hill, as the storm raged around her. What was she burying, and who was she hiding it from? To understand that, we have to go back. Back 3 months to a day when the sun was as cruel as the storm. A day that started not with a shovel, but with a rope. 3 months earlier, the town of Silver Creek baked under a merciless sun. The crowd gathered in the town square, their Sunday best looking strange and out of place against the dusty, hard-scrabble backdrop of the frontier. They stood in a half circle, their faces a mixture of grim duty and morbid curiosity. At the center of it all was Hannah Blackwood. Her blue dress was wrinkled and stained. Her wrists were bound tight with a rough rope that bit into her skin. But she didn't struggle. She knew it was useless. Judgment had already been passed, and the judge, jury, and executioner was her own brother-in-law, Ezra Blackwood. Ezra stood before her, a Bible in one hand, the other pointing to the heavens. He was a man who believed God spoke directly to him, and that God's voice sounded a lot like his own. "Every tree that does not bear good fruit is cut down and thrown into the fire," he boomed, his voice echoing across the silent square. He was quoting scripture, but he was talking about Hannah. Hannah stared at a point just past his shoulder, refusing to let him see her fear. She'd cried her last tears long ago, in the dark, empty rooms of the house she used to call home. Ezra turned to the crowd, his voice dripping with self-righteousness. 5 times, he declared, the Lord blessed the union of my brother Samuel and this woman. 5 times he gave them the miracle of new life. He paused, letting the words hang in the hot, still air. And 5 times, this vessel proved unworthy. A murmur went through the crowd. Some nodded. Others shuffled their feet, looking at the ground, ashamed to be a part of this. And when my brother, God rest his soul, was taken from us in that tragic stampede, what did we discover? Ezra's voice rose, filled with manufactured grief. No heir, no son to carry the Blackwood name. Nothing but empty promises in a barren womb. Hannah flinched. Each word was a fresh cut on a wound that had never healed. 5 tiny graves. 5 souls who left before they'd even arrived. Her husband, Samuel, had been her comfort through it all. But then the stampede had taken him too, leaving her alone to face Ezra's cold cruelty. At Samuel's funeral, Ezra had looked at her not with sympathy, but with accusation. God punishes those who fail his purposes, he'd said. Now that punishment was being made public. Near the edge of the crowd, Sheriff Thomas Hayes stood, his face a mask of conflict. He was the law, but in Silver Creek, Ezra Blackwood was the law. "It's just a public humbling, Hannah," he'd told her earlier, unable to meet her eyes. "It'll keep the peace." Peace, it felt more like a sacrifice. "The law of our fathers is clear," Ezra shouted, reaching his grand finale. A woman who cannot fulfill her God-given purpose has no claim to the Blackwood land or name. On his signal, two men grabbed Hannah's arms and dragged her to the old oak tree at the edge of the square. A rope hung from one of its branches, a crude noose at the end. The crowd fell silent. This wasn't a hanging to kill, it was a hanging to shame. A ritual designed to brand her as worthless in the eyes of everyone she knew. The rough hemp of the noose scratched against her neck. Hannah closed her eyes, and for a second, she wasn't there. She was with Samuel on their wedding day, him spinning her until her dress billowed out like a cloud. She remembered the hopeful swell of her belly, the joy in his eyes, and then the pain, the blood, the doctor's sad face, the small wooden boxes. 5 times. She remembered the tea Samuel would bring her, an herbal remedy prepared by Ezra himself. To help you carry to term next time, Samuel would say, his hope unwavering. Now she wondered about that tea. The rope tightened. It lifted her just enough that only her toes brushed the dirt. Her breath came in shallow, panicked gasps. The message was clear. This is the price of failure. But as she dangled there, fighting for air, something shifted. The fear turned to ice, then to steel. She opened her eyes, not looking at the judgmental crowd, but directly at Ezra. There was no hatred in her gaze, just a cold, profound disappointment that seemed to slice right through him. For a split second, Ezra faltered. Something flickered in his eyes, doubt, guilt, or maybe just the shock of seeing a victim who refused to look broken. He quickly recovered, turning back to his audience. "Let this be a lesson," he roared. "Let all remember the judgment that falls upon those who cannot fulfill their sacred duties." They left her there for 20 minutes. 20 minutes of burning lungs and bruising skin. 20 minutes for humiliation to soak into her bones. When they finally cut her down, she crumpled to the ground, gasping. No one helped her. No one offered a hand. Ezra gave a curt nod to the sheriff. "Until the court settles the deed, she is cast out from this family and this town." He turned his back on her, the ultimate dismissal. God's will has been done. The crowd began to disperse, leaving Hannah alone in the dirt. She struggled to her feet, swaying, her hand touching the angry red welt on her neck. As she stood there, a lone figure in the dust, an old woman named Martha Simmons hobbled over. She pushed a small flask into Hannah's hand. "Drink," she said. The liquid burned, but it steadied her. "This town has a short memory for kindness and a long one for cruelty," Martha whispered. "Walk north. Don't stop. There are good people beyond Miller's Creek if you have the strength to find them." And with that, Hannah Blackwood walked out of Silver Creek. She had nothing but the clothes on her back and the weight of a town's scorn on her shoulders. She didn't know where she was going. She only knew she had to survive, because Ezra had taken her home, her name, and her dignity. But he had underestimated one thing. He hadn't taken her fight. The Montana sun was relentless. By afternoon, Hannah was stumbling, her throat raw, her vision blurring. She saw a water trough at an abandoned homestead and staggered towards it. The water was warm and tasted of algae, but it was the most wonderful thing she'd ever tasted. She drank until she couldn't anymore, then splashed the cool liquid on her face and the burning rope mark on her neck. As she straightened up, the world spun. Black spots danced in her eyes. She sank to her knees, her body finally giving up. Her last thought was of Samuel, his face full of love and hope for a future that had been stolen from them both. Then darkness. When she woke, it wasn't to the hard-packed earth. It was to softness, a real bed. The smell of wood smoke and coffee filled the air. Panic flared, but she quickly realized her clothes were still on, though someone had loosened her collar to check the burns. She was in a small, one-room cabin. It was simple but clean. Sunlight streamed through a window, illuminating a cup of steaming tea on a small table beside her. Next to it was a folded piece of paper. With a trembling hand, she opened it. The note said, "Rest. I will return at sundown." No name, no explanation. Who had found her? And why had they brought her here? She sipped the tea, the herbs soothing her throat. As her strength returned, she stood up and looked around. The cabin belonged to someone practical. A rifle hung over the door. A small shelf held books on farming and a medical text. And then she saw it. On a shelf of medicines and tinctures, there was a familiar brown bottle. The handwritten label read, Valerian Root Tincture. Her blood ran cold. The memory hit her like a physical blow. A doctor's office in Helena 7 years ago. She and Samuel, desperate for answers after her first miscarriage. A young, serious-faced doctor. He had been kind but clinical. Sometimes, the doctor had told them, looking directly at Hannah, the greatest thing we can do is accept the hand fate has dealt us. He had given Samuel a bottle of this exact tincture. To help with the anxiety, he'd said. Now, standing in this stranger's cabin, miles from anywhere, she was looking at another bottle, prepared by the same hand. It was impossible, but there it was. What was a doctor from Helena doing, living out here in the wilderness? The sound of hoofbeats pulled her from her thoughts. She rushed to the window. A man was dismounting from a dappled gray mare. He moved with an easy confidence, his shoulders broad under a worn leather coat. When he turned toward the cabin, Hannah's breath caught in her throat. He was older, his face weathered by the sun and covered by a beard. But it was him. It was the doctor from Helena. He didn't see her. He pumped some water, splashed his face, and then gathered an armful of firewood. Hannah backed away from the window, her mind racing. Did he recognize her? Should she say something? The door opened, and Matthew Thornton stepped inside. He showed no surprise at seeing her awake. He just nodded as he dropped the wood by the fireplace. "You're up," he said. His voice was deeper, rougher than she remembered. "That's good." You helped me," she stammered. "Found you half dead by Miller's Creek," he replied, busying himself with the fire. He didn't look at her. "Fever broke last night." "How long was I here?" she asked, realizing with a jolt she'd lost time. 2 days, he said, finally turning to face her. His eyes were unreadable. There was no sign he remembered her at all. It was just a clinical assessment. You needed the rest. The silence that followed should have been awkward, but it wasn't. He didn't ask about the rope burns. He didn't ask why a woman was collapsed by the side of the road. He just ladled some thick stew into a bowl and set it on the table. "Eat," he said. "You need your strength." She ate while he worked, moving around the cabin with a quiet efficiency. For the first time in what felt like a lifetime, Hannah was in a room with someone who wanted nothing from her. No air, no explanations, no apologies. When she finished, he took her bowl without a word. He leaned against the counter and finally spoke again. "You can stay until you're healed up proper," he said. "Spare bed's yours." She had nowhere to go. No money, no family. Pride fought with desperation, and desperation won. "I'd be grateful," she said. "I can work, cook, clean. I won't be a burden." A flicker of something, maybe amusement, crossed his eyes. "Not worried about that." He glanced out the window. "Need to check the livestock. Rest." And then he was gone. Hannah watched him cross the clearing to a small barn. The sun was setting, casting long golden rays through the pine trees. Her throat ached. Her future was a terrifying blank page. But in that moment, in this strange, quiet place, with this silent, mysterious man, she felt something she hadn't felt since before Samuel died. Peace. But she was wrong. This wasn't a place of peace. It was just the calm before an even bigger storm. And the man who had saved her life was hiding a secret far darker than her own. The days at Matthew's homestead fell into a quiet rhythm. He would rise before dawn, and she would wake to the smell of coffee and the sound of him chopping wood. They worked in a comfortable silence, mending fences, tending to the small vegetable garden, caring for his 3 horses. The homestead was a world away from the judgment of Silver Creek. Here she was judged only by the work of her hands. The angry rope burn on her neck faded, but the scars on the inside were slower to heal. Still, with each passing day, Hannah felt a little bit of her old self returning. The physical labor was grounding, connecting her to the earth in a way that felt pure and honest. One afternoon, while she was brushing down Willow, the dappled gray mare, Matthew spoke, breaking their usual silence. "You're good with them," he said, nodding towards the horse. "My father taught me," she replied, stroking Willow's velvety nose. Matthew watched her, his expression thoughtful. He taught you well. He paused, then added, it takes patience. You can't force a horse to trust you. You have to earn it. Reckon people aren't so different. The comment hung in the air. It was the most personal thing he'd said since she arrived. It was a small crack in the wall he'd built around himself. She wondered what had happened to the doctor from Helena. What had driven him to this solitary life? That evening, she found a loaf of old bread and made bread pudding, a simple comfort food her grandmother used to make. The cabin filled with the warm, sweet scent of cinnamon and baked custard. When Matthew came in from his chores, he stopped in the doorway, and for a moment his impassive mask slipped. Surprise and something else, something like pain, flickered across his face. Hope you don't mind, she said, suddenly nervous. Don't mind, he mumbled, hanging his hat. He took a bite of the pudding, and his eyes closed for a fraction of a second. Been a while, he said, his voice quiet. My grandmother made it when we were sick or sad, Hannah found herself saying. She said sweetness was God's way of reminding us that bitterness doesn't last forever. Matthew looked at her, a long, searching look. He didn't say anything, but something shifted between them, an understanding, a shared recognition of loss. A week after she arrived, Hannah was up early, getting the coffee started. Tucked under a shelf, she noticed a small wooden chest she hadn't seen before. It was beautifully carved with wildflowers. Curiosity got the better of her. She lifted the lid. Inside, her breath caught in her throat. A tiny baby's blanket made of soft blue wool. Beneath it, a small silver rattle and a pair of hand-knitted booties. They had been treasured, lovingly preserved. Elizabeth made that. Hannah jumped, startled by Matthew's voice. He was standing in the doorway, his face unreadable in the pre-dawn light. I'm sorry, she whispered, closing the chest. I shouldn't have. It's all right, he said, moving past her to the fire. Been a long time since I looked in there myself. A heavy silence filled the small cabin. Elizabeth was your wife? Hannah ventured. He nodded once, his back to her. Was. The single word was a gravestone. After a long moment, he spoke again, his voice flat and empty. You'll find 3 small graves behind the North Ridge. Elizabeth and our 2 babies are there. The third one was too small to bury. Hannah's heart broke. Not just for him, but with him. She knew that particular kind of emptiness. The loss of a child that was barely there. A ghost of a hope. I'm so sorry, Matthew. He finally turned to face her, and the raw pain in his eyes was staggering. You lose one child, folks say they're sorry. You lose your wife and all your babies, they don't know what to say, so they say nothing. His voice wasn't bitter. It was just a statement of fact. After a while, you stop expecting them to understand. Yes, Hannah whispered, thinking of the averted eyes in Silver Creek. You do. In that moment, they weren't a rescuer and a victim. They were 2 survivors, 2 people who had stood on the same desolate shore of grief. They understood each other in a way no one else could. That afternoon, they worked side by side, clearing fallen branches from a pasture. The silence between them was different now. It wasn't empty. It was full of everything they hadn't said, everything they didn't need to say. As the sun set, they stood on a small hill overlooking the valley. It's beautiful here, Hannah said softly. Reminds you how small our troubles are, Matthew replied. The unexpected philosophy surprised her. Is that why you came here? To make your troubles smaller? He was quiet for a long time. Partly, he finally admitted. Mostly I came because out here, no one asked questions. He looked at her, a flicker of irony in his eyes. Until now. I'm sorry, she said quickly. I don't mean to pry. You're not, he said, turning back toward the cabin. Sometimes questions need asking, just not always answering right away. As they neared the cabin, Hannah saw a small, overgrown path leading away from the clearing. What's down there? She asked. Matthew's expression sobered. The graves I mentioned. She hesitated. May I? He gave a slight nod. I'll see to dinner. He needed to be alone. She understood. She followed the path to a small clearing. 3 simple wooden crosses stood in a row. The middle one was for Elizabeth. The 2 smaller ones had only dates. She knelt, her heart aching for this family she'd never known. She touched the weathered wood of Elizabeth's cross. "Hello, Elizabeth," she whispered to the wind. "I'm Hannah. Your husband saved my life." She stayed there as the light faded, a silent communion with a woman whose pain she understood all too well. When she returned to the cabin, Matthew had dinner ready. After they ate, he brought out a small, polished wooden box. "This was Elizabeth's," he said, his voice rough. "Her music box." With gentle reverence, Hannah lifted the lid. The sweet, clear notes of a lullaby filled the cabin. It was a melody of love and loss, a sound that had been silent for far too long. She looked up and saw Matthew watching her, his expression softer than she'd ever seen it. "It still works," he said quietly. "Yes," she replied. "It does." In that moment, listening to the ghost of a lullaby in a cabin haunted by grief, Hannah felt a tiny seed of healing take root in her own barren heart. But she had no idea that the man who shared her grief was also connected to its cause, and the truth, when it came, would be more devastating than she could ever imagine. The fragile peace of the homestead was shattered by the arrival of a visitor, a young woman on a bay mare, picking her way up the trail. Matthew grabbed his rifle, his body instantly tense. Visitors were not a normal occurrence. The woman was in her mid-20s, dressed plainly. "Dr. Thornton!" she called out, her voice respectful. Matthew relaxed slightly. "Miss Collins," he acknowledged. "Long ride from town." The woman, Sarah Collins, dismounted. "I hope I'm not intruding." Her eyes flickered curiously toward Hannah. "Mrs. Peterson's baby has the croup again. Nothing the town doctor prescribed is helping. I remembered your tincture." Matthew nodded and led her inside. Hannah busied herself making coffee, listening as Sarah updated Matthew on the health of various people in town. Patients, she realized. People from his old life. "They all ask after you, you know," Sarah said. "Town has a proper doctor now," Matthew grunted, mixing a remedy. "Dr. Williamson means well," Sarah said diplomatically, "but he doesn't have your touch, or your understanding of difficult cases." Matthew handed her the vial with instructions. As Hannah poured the coffee, he finally made the introductions. "Sarah Collins, this is Hannah Blackwood. She's staying here for a time." He looked at Hannah. Miss Collins was a nurse in Helena. Now she teaches at the Silver Creek School. Silver Creek. The name hit Hannah like a physical blow. She almost dropped the coffee pot. "You're from Silver Creek?" Sarah Collins nodded, her expression turning somber. "Yes, Mrs. Blackwood. I know who you are." She looked from Hannah to Matthew and back again. "I was there. That day in the square." Her cheeks flushed with shame. "I wanted to speak up, but Ezra Blackwood is not a man to be crossed openly." Hannah sank into a chair. The past she'd been trying to escape had just walked through the door. "Many in town didn't agree with what was done to you," Sarah continued, her voice earnest. "But they're afraid. Ezra controls everything. The bank. The store. He has half the town in his debt." "Is that why you came?" Hannah asked, her voice hollow. "To tell me this?" "I came for the Peterson baby," Sarah said. "But yes, Sheriff Hayes mentioned you might be here. I wanted you to know you're not alone." "Sheriff Hayes?" Matthew asked sharply. "He's concerned for your welfare," Sarah explained. "He feels responsible for not stopping it." She looked at Hannah. "And there's something else you need to know. Ezra is filing papers to claim the ranch. All of it. He's using your public humiliation as proof that you've forfeited your rights." Matthew slammed his coffee mug down on the table. "A mockery of justice to commit theft." "He claims the land must pass to a male heir," Sarah confirmed. "Since you and Samuel had none." She trailed off, her apology hanging in the air. A cold, sharp fury began to build inside Hannah. This wasn't just about punishment or religious fervor. It was about greed. "He arranged that whole spectacle just to take my land." "The land, the cattle, the Blackwood name," Sarah said grimly. "He's been working toward this since Samuel died, using God to justify his avarice." Matthew had gone to the window, his back to them, but the tension in his shoulders was palpable. "When is this legal challenge?" he asked. 3 weeks, Sarah replied. "At the county courthouse. Sheriff Hayes said he would testify on your behalf if you decide to contest it." Hannah let out a bitter laugh. "And what would I say? That the law favors men in these matters? That Ezra is cruel? Perhaps, Sarah said, her voice firm. But the truth has a power of its own, Mrs. Blackwood, and you are stronger than Ezra knows. After Sarah left, the quiet of the homestead felt different. It was no longer peaceful. It was charged with tension. The outside world had found them. That evening, Matthew finally broke the silence. You should fight for what's yours, he said abruptly. The land? Hannah scoffed. What would I do with a ranch? I can't run it alone. You wouldn't have to be alone, he replied. The point is, it's yours. Samuel meant for you to have it. Letting Ezra take it, that's letting him win. Twice. His words hit home. In her pain, she had been ready to surrender. But he was right. Letting Ezra win was unthinkable. I have no money for lawyers, she said, the protest sounding weak even to her. I do. The offer was so immediate, so certain, it shocked her. Why? You barely know me. Matthew looked away, uncomfortable. I've known enough men like Ezra, he said, men who use God's name to cover their own greed. Someone needs to stand against them. It wasn't the whole truth. She knew it. There was something else driving him, something personal, but she didn't press. I'll think about it, she promised. Later that night, unable to sleep, she sat on the porch steps under a brilliant canopy of stars. The door creaked open, and Matthew came out, draping a blanket around her shoulders. They sat in silence for a long time. I used to know all their names, he said eventually, his voice low. The constellations. Elizabeth loved them. My father said they were God's promises, Hannah replied, that even in the darkest night, we're never truly alone. You believe that? Matthew asked. After everything? I believe, she said slowly, that there's something larger than us. Larger than Ezra's God of judgment. I have to believe that. Otherwise, none of it makes sense. He was quiet for a moment. When Elizabeth died, he said, his voice rough, I stopped looking for sense in any of it. He turned to look at her in the starlight. Now I'm not so sure. The admission felt monumental. Something had shifted in him, too. This quiet refuge had been a place of healing for both of them. And in that moment, a decision crystallized in Hannah's mind. I'll fight for the land, she said, her voice filled with a sudden, clear certainty. Not because I want it, but because it's right. A slow smile touched Matthew's lips in the darkness. Good. As they sat there, a new feeling took root in Hannah's heart. It wasn't just determination. It was hope, a fragile, cautious hope that her story wasn't over. But as they planned their fight, a chilling thought began to form. A connection between Ezra's greed and her 5 lost children. A suspicion so monstrous, she could barely bring herself to consider it. And she had no idea Matthew held the key. The decision to fight changed everything. The quiet homestead became a command center. They pored over maps and old documents Samuel had left, searching for anything that could help. But the real shift happened one evening on the porch. As Matthew finally voiced the terrible suspicion that had been lurking in the shadows of Hannah's mind. Miss Collins mentioned Ezra's greed, Matthew began, his voice careful, the way he needed you to be without an heir to get the land. He paused, then looked at her directly. Hannah, did you ever suspect the medicine Samuel brought home? The herbs Ezra prepared? The question landed like a stone in a silent pool. She had suspected. She had pushed the thought away as paranoia, as grief playing tricks on her mind. But hearing him say it, it made it real. The taste, she whispered, wrapping her arms around herself. After my first loss, Ezra started providing the herbs. He said they would strengthen my womb. Samuel trusted him completely. But after a while, the tea tasted different, bitter. Her voice trembled. When I mentioned it to Samuel, he said I was imagining things, that my grief was making me confused. Matthew's face hardened. It's a classic technique. Make the victim doubt their own senses, their own sanity. You really think? She couldn't finish the sentence. The idea was too monstrous. You think he poisoned me? Deliberately? I think, Matthew said, his voice cold as steel, that a man willing to publicly torture his brother's widow for financial gain is capable of anything. He leaned forward, his eyes intense. Did you keep any of it? Any of the herbs? She shook her head, a fresh wave of despair washing over her. Samuel made me take it all. He said it was too precious to waste. A bitter, broken laugh escaped her lips. Precious? They sat in a stunned silence. The truth was there, hanging between them, a horrifying, invisible monster. They had no proof, just a bitter taste and a pattern of death. It was her word against the most powerful man in Silver Creek. "We need proof," Matthew said finally. "Suspicions won't be enough in court." "But how?" Hannah cried. "Any evidence is long gone." "Maybe not," Matthew said, his mind working. "Men like Ezra are arrogant. They often keep records of their schemes. It feeds their ego." He stood up, pacing the small porch. "The Blackwood house is out of reach, but Miss Collins said he's a trustee at the school. He has a desk there. And Sheriff Hayes, if he's truly on our side, he might be willing to look." The idea of a secret search, of uncovering Ezra's private papers, was terrifying, but it was also their only hope. The fight for the land had just become a fight for a much deeper, darker truth. It was no longer about property, it was about murder. A few days later, they rode into Silver Creek. It was market day, and the town was bustling. As they rode down the main street, conversation stopped. Heads turned. Whispers followed them like a trail of smoke. Hannah kept her head high, Matthew riding close beside her, a silent, protective presence. They hitched their horses outside the general store. "I won't hide in the hills like I've done something wrong," Hannah said, her voice firm. The moment they stepped inside, the store fell quiet. Ezra Blackwood was there. He stood framed in the doorway, a cold smile on his lips. "Well, well," he said, his voice dripping with venom. "The prodigal sister-in-law returns." He let his eyes drift over Matthew. "And she's found herself a protector. How quaint." "Ezra," Hannah said, her voice steady, "I trust you've recovered from your ordeal," he sneered. The insinuation was clear, meant to shame them both. Matthew stepped forward slightly. "Mr. Blackwood," he said, his tone deceptively calm, "I hear congratulations are in order. Taking another man's property is quite an achievement." Ezra's smile vanished. "The property was never hers. Blackwood land passes to Blackwood men." "Curious," Matthew replied. "I understood your brother left a will naming his wife as his heir. A will made when he assumed she could fulfill her sacred duty." Ezra spat, his control slipping. He turned his venom on Hannah. "You failed. The whole town saw it." The dam inside Hannah broke. "And what of your duties, Ezra?" She shot back, her voice ringing through the silent storm. "Your duty to honor your dead brother's wishes? Your duty to show mercy? Your duty to basic human decency?" He took a step towards her, his face a mask of rage. "You dare speak to me of duty? You should be grateful I allowed you to keep your life." "Allowed her?" Matthew's voice was dangerously quiet. "You speak as if you're God himself." Ezra turned on Matthew. "And you, Dr. Thornton, don't think I don't know why you left Helena. Don't think I don't know what you did." A sudden tension filled the air. Ezra knew something about Matthew's past, a secret he was using as a weapon. Before the confrontation could escalate further, Sheriff Hayes appeared in the doorway. "Problem here?" he asked, his hand resting on his gun. Ezra straightened up, his composure returning. "No problem, Sheriff. Just welcoming my sister-in-law." He gave Hannah a final, chilling smile. "I look forward to seeing you at the hearing. I'm sure the judge will be most interested in your current living arrangements." With that parting shot, he was gone. The sheriff led them to his office. He looked older, wearier. "I owe you an apology, Mrs. Blackwood," he began. "What happened in the square? I should have stopped it." He sighed. "Ezra holds this town in a grip of fear, but no more." He reached into his desk drawer and pulled out a small, leather-bound journal. "Sarah Collins found this in his desk at the schoolhouse." He slid it across the desk. With trembling hands, Hannah opened it. Matthew leaned over her shoulder. It was Ezra's handwriting. Meticulous notes on cattle sales, church matters, and then they saw it. A section labeled HB treatment, dates, notations, increased dosage, added wormwood, symptoms promising. "Patient complains of bitterness," Samuel reassured her. "His loyalty is useful. Fifth attempt successful. The last obstacle is removed. The land will be mine. The world tilted. The air left her lungs. It wasn't a suspicion anymore. It was here, in black and white, cold, calculated, evil. My God, she whispered. He was poisoning me. He killed them. All of them. Matthew's hand gripped her shoulder, a steadying anchor in a world that was spinning out of control. Sheriff Hayes nodded grimly. It's damning, but prosecuting him here, impossible. The judge is his cousin's father-in-law. The town is terrified of him. So he gets away with it? Hannah asked, her voice flat with despair. I didn't say that, the sheriff countered. We can't prosecute him for murder here. Not yet. But this journal, this is evidence in the civil case. You present this at the hearing, prove he caused your childlessness to steal the land. He leaned forward. Even a corrupt judge would have trouble ignoring this. We can win the land back. It's a start. As he spoke, Matthew stiffened, looking out the window. Ezra's coming back, heading this way. Go out the back, the sheriff urged, handing Hannah the journal. Keep this safe. Be careful. Ezra won't take this challenge lying down. He'll fight dirty. They slipped out the back just as Ezra's shadow fell across the front door. Clutching the journal, Hannah felt a flicker of something she hadn't felt in years. It wasn't just fear or anger. It was the first faint glimmer of justice. But Ezra Blackwood was like a cornered snake, and a cornered snake is when it's most deadly. They had the proof, but now they had to live long enough to use it. The ride back to the homestead was a blur of shock and grief. The confirmation of Ezra's betrayal was a heavier burden than the suspicion had ever been. He killed them, Hannah said, the words tasting like ash. My babies. Yes, Matthew said simply, his voice a low rumble of suppressed fury. I knew something was wrong, she continued, the words tumbling out. But Samuel, he trusted him so completely. This isn't your fault, Hannah, Matthew said, his voice firm. Men like Ezra thrive on making their victims blame themselves. When they got back to the cabin, the silence was thick with unspoken truths. Hannah finally found the courage to ask the question Ezra's threat had planted in her mind. What did he mean? In the store. About why you left Helena. Matthew stared into the fire, the flames reflecting in his haunted eyes. And the story came out. The story of his wife, Elizabeth, and the profound depression that had consumed her after losing their third child. She was suffering, he said, his voice raw, not just in her body, but in her soul. She begged me to help her end it. Hannah's breath hitched. I gave her enough laudanum to ease her pain, he confessed, his voice barely a whisper. Enough to let her sleep. Pneumonia took her in that sleep without a fight. I didn't kill her, Hannah, but I didn't save her either. As a doctor, as a husband, I failed. You showed her mercy, Hannah said, her voice thick with emotion. She reached out and took his hand. That's not failure. The medical board in Helena disagreed, or at least the rumors said they did, he said, a bitter twist to his lips. An investigation cleared me, but my reputation was ruined, so I left. Ezra must have heard the rumors. He collects secrets like a vulture collects bones. His confession forged a new, unbreakable bond between them. They were both survivors of Ezra's cruelty, in different ways. They both had ghosts. Their planning became more urgent. The hearing was only days away. They knew Ezra would not let them get there. The warning came in the dead of night. First, Sarah Collins arrived, breathless and terrified. Ezra knows about the journal, she gasped. Someone told him. He's furious. He's gathering men, talking about frontier justice. And then another visitor, old Martha Simmons, appearing out of the darkness like a ghost. He knows you're going to Helena, she warned. He hired guns from the mining camps. 12 men, maybe more. They planned to ride at first light to make sure you never testify. There was no more time. They had to run. Now. As they frantically packed, Matthew led Hannah to a hidden compartment beneath his floorboards. Inside was a bag of money and a bundle of letters. My savings, he said. If anything happens to me, they're yours. Use them to build a new life. Nothing is going to happen to you, she insisted. Now you know, just in case, he said. In the midst of the chaos, Hannah paused by Elizabeth's music box. On impulse, she opened it, the sweet lullaby filling the tense air. Matthew came over, his expression softening. "Take it," he said quietly. "Elizabeth would want you to have it. You, you bring music back into a place that's been silent for too long." He leaned in, his hand gently cupping her cheek, and he kissed her. It was a kiss full of desperation and hope, a promise made in the shadow of death. A kiss that said everything they hadn't had time to say. "I know," he whispered when they parted. "Bad timing. Or maybe," she breathed, "exactly the right timing. A reminder of what we're fighting for." They fled into the darkness on horseback, the journal wrapped in oilcloth and tucked securely in Hannah's saddlebag. The forest was their only shield. Behind them, a posse of hired guns was gathering, fueled by whiskey and Ezra's poison. Ahead of them, a storm was brewing, a real storm, with thunder and lightning that mirrored the tempest in their hearts. They found shelter in an old abandoned line shack, just as the heavens opened up. The rain came down in solid sheets, a temporary reprieve. They knew Ezra's men wouldn't ride in this deluge. "Try to get some sleep," Matthew said, taking up a position by the door, his rifle across his lap. As Hannah lay on the narrow cot, listening to the storm rage, she watched him, his steady, silent vigil. This man who had saved her, who had believed her, who was now risking his life for her. She was falling in love with him. The thought was terrifying and beautiful all at once. She woke at dawn. The storm had passed, but the world was a sea of mud. Their tracks would be easy to follow. "We'll be slower now," Matthew said grimly. "They'll gain on us fast." They pushed the horses hard. Around midday, they saw it in the distance. Helena, a smudge on the horizon, but it was there. Sanctuary. "We'll make it," Matthew said, a hint of relief in his voice. And that's when disaster struck. A low-hanging branch caught Hannah, not knocking her off, but tearing her saddlebag free. It tumbled down a steep, muddy embankment and plunged into a rain-swollen creek. The journal. "No!" she screamed, scrambling down the slope. Matthew was right behind her. He waded into the rushing, ice-cold water without a second thought, grabbing the bag just before it was swept away. Hannah ripped it open, her hands shaking. The oilcloth had held. The pages were damp, but the ink was still legible. The truth was safe. But then they heard it, the sound of horses. Close. Too close. They scrambled back up the embankment. But in the chaos, Hannah's horse, Willow, had spooked and run off. "Damn it," Matthew swore. The riders were getting closer. They could hear men shouting. "We'll have to ride double," he said, helping her onto his powerful black stallion, Storm, and swinging up behind her. They plunged back into the dense forest, Storm moving with incredible speed. But they were being hunted now, the posse fanning out, closing in. Matthew guided Storm into a narrow ravine, a temporary hiding place. "They found Willow," he whispered. "They know we're on foot, or close to it." He looked at her, his face grim but resolute. "Helena is still 4 miles away, too far to outrun them with Storm carrying double." He knew what he had to do, and she knew it too. "You take Storm," he said, his voice urgent. "Take the journal and ride. Don't stop for anything." "No!" she cried, grabbing his arm. "I won't leave you." "Listen to me," he said, his hands gripping her shoulders. "This isn't about me. It's about justice. It's about those children. The journal is the only thing that matters." "You matter," she sobbed. The sound of the posse was right on top of them. He pulled her into a fierce, desperate kiss. "I'll find you in Helena," he promised. "Trust me." Before she could argue, he pushed her onto the stallion, slapped its flank, and shouted, "Go! Now!" As Storm leaped forward, carrying her towards safety, she looked back. She saw Matthew run in the opposite direction, deliberately making noise, drawing the hunters away from her. A gunshot echoed through the trees, then another, and another. Tears streamed down her face, but she didn't stop. She couldn't. He was sacrificing himself for her, for the truth. She leaned low over Storm's neck and rode like the devil himself was on her heels. Because he was. Hannah rode into Helena like a phantom, her face streaked with tears and mud, the great black stallion heaving beneath her. She didn't stop until she reached the grand facade of the Montana Hotel, where the judge was staying. She half fell from the saddle, thrusting the reins at a stunned stable boy. "Take care of him," she gasped. "He saved my life." Inside, she ignored the shocked stares of the wealthy guests in the lobby. She marched to the front desk, clutching the precious journal to her chest. "I need to see Judge Morrison," she announced, her voice shaking but firm. "Tell him Hannah Blackwood is here, and tell him Ezra Blackwood's men are coming to stop me." The clerk, seeing the wild desperation in her eyes, didn't argue. Minutes later, a distinguished silver-haired man appeared. Judge Morrison. He listened, his expression growing more grave with every word she spoke. He took the journal, his sharp eyes scanning the damning pages. "This goes far beyond a property dispute, Mrs. Blackwood," he said, his voice grim. "These are federal crimes." Just then, a U.S. Marshal burst in. "Your Honor, a group of armed men are outside. They're demanding to see Mrs. Blackwood." Ezra, he'd followed her. "Inform them," the judge said, his voice ringing with authority, "that Mrs. Blackwood is a federal witness under my protection. Any attempt to interfere will result in their immediate arrest." Hannah was safe, for now, but her heart ached with a terrible fear. "There was a man with me," she told the judge, her voice breaking. "Dr. Matthew Thornton. He stayed behind. He's in danger." The judge promised to send a search party at first light. He showed her to a secure room, and she collapsed onto the bed, utterly spent. She took out Elizabeth's music box, the one Matthew had given her. The sweet, sad lullaby filled the lonely room as tears of grief and fear finally came. She wept for her lost children, for Samuel, and for the brave, quiet man who had sacrificed himself for her. The next morning, the hearing began. The territorial courthouse was packed. Hannah walked in, flanked by marshals, her head held high. She saw Ezra across the room, his face a mask of cold fury. He still thought he could win. He still thought his power and influence would save him. He was wrong. Hannah stood and told her story. She spoke of her marriage, her hopes, and the 5 devastating losses. She spoke of the bitter-tasting tea, of Samuel's misplaced trust, and of Ezra's calculated cruelty. Then she presented the journal. The clerk read the entries aloud, and a wave of shock and disgust rippled through the courtroom. When it was Ezra's turn, he denied everything. He called the journal a forgery. He called Hannah a desperate, hysterical woman. He attacked her witnesses, calling Sheriff Hayes a lovesick fool, and Martha Simmons a senile old woman. And then he turned his venom on Matthew. "And this Dr. Thornton she speaks of," Ezra sneered, "is a disgraced physician who fled Helena after assisting in his own wife's suicide." A gasp went through the crowd. Hannah leaped to her feet, a cry of protest on her lips. But before she could speak, the courtroom doors swung open. A U.S. Marshal strode down the aisle, and walking beside him, bruised and bandaged but alive, was Matthew Thornton. "Your Honor," the Marshal announced, "Dr. Thornton has arrived with additional evidence." A stunned silence fell over the room. Ezra's face went pale. Matthew's eyes found Hannah's, and in that one look, a world of relief and love passed between them. He walked to the front, handing the judge a small leather pouch. "Your Honor," Matthew said, his voice clear and strong, "these are samples of the substances mentioned in Ezra Blackwood's journal. They were recovered from a hidden compartment in his office at the schoolhouse." He then calmly and methodically dismantled Ezra's lie about his past, presenting the official medical board findings that cleared him of any wrongdoing in his wife's death. The tide had not just turned, it had become a tidal wave. One by one, the pieces of Ezra's web of lies fell apart. Sheriff Hayes' sworn statement was read, and then a surprise witness appeared. Sarah Collins, who had ridden all night, testified about Ezra's threats and his attempt to stop Hannah from reaching Helena. Ezra Blackwood, the man who had ruled Silver Creek through fear, was trapped. The evidence was absolute, overwhelming, irrefutable. The judge's ruling was swift and brutal. "This court finds," he declared, his voice booming, "that the Blackwood estate is the rightful property of Mrs. Hannah Blackwood. Furthermore, given the serious criminal nature of his actions, this court remands Mr. Ezra Blackwood to the custody of the federal marshals, pending formal charges of assault, attempted murder, and witness intimidation." As the marshals moved in, Ezra finally snapped. "You can't do this to me!" he roared, his face purple with rage. I am Ezra Blackwood. The land was never yours, Ezra, Hannah said, her voice cutting through his tirade. You just made people too afraid to tell you so. As they dragged him away, screaming threats and curses, Hannah felt a strange emptiness. It was over. Justice had been served, but nothing could bring back what he had taken. Matthew came to her side, his hand finding hers. He can't hurt you anymore, he said softly. No, she agreed, but that doesn't mean we can't build something new from what remains. They walked out of the courthouse and into the bright Montana sunshine. They were both scarred. They were both survivors. But for the first time, they were free. They returned to Silver Creek not as outcasts, but as victors. Hannah, with Matthew by her side, took possession of the ranch. But it wasn't her dream. It was Samuel's. So she sold most of it, keeping only a small piece of land with a view of the mountains. There they began to build a new life, a smaller house, and an orchard. One autumn afternoon, as they planted the last of the young apple trees, Matthew turned to her. He held out a small, hand-carved box. Inside, on a bed of velvet, was a simple gold ring with a single perfect pearl. I know we've both had enough of promises forced upon us, he said, his voice thick with emotion. But I am sure, Hannah. I've been sure since I watched you ride away from that ravine, and I realized I could not live in a world without you in it. Marry me. Tears of joy, a feeling she thought she'd never know again, streamed down her face. Yes, she whispered. Yes, I will marry you. They named their new home Mercy Orchard, a testament to Elizabeth, to the children they'd both lost, and to the mercy they had found in each other. They built a life not on the absence of scars, but on the shared strength it took to bear them. A quiet, beautiful life, filled with the simple joy of watching saplings grow into strong, fruit-bearing trees. The darkness of Ezra Blackwood had almost consumed them, but in the end, it was their light, their courage, their truth, and their love that burned brighter. If you were moved by Hannah's incredible journey from victim to survivor, make sure you hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. You won't want to miss the next story we uncover from the shadows.